The problem with playing dirty is that eventually you'll slip in your own mess. And oh, did they slip? What started as a scheme to erase you from the narrative turned into a courtroom exorcism, exposing lies, secret agendas, and generational theft wrapped in Sunday clothes. They thought this case would be quick, silenced, buried, forgotten. But here you are, not just walking into the courtroom, but walking out with the inheritance they never saw coming. Let's talk about it. Because when the chosen one shows up, the real judge isn't wearing a robe, he's wearing glory. Fact, over 70% of inheritance disputes are triggered not by money itself, but by long-buried jealousy, control, and the fear of being irrelevant when the real heir rises. And let's be honest, nothing exposes a fake family member faster than a missing zero on a bank statement. Now they're not just bitter, they're panicked. Because the same people who plotted to bury you are now whispering criminal charges, loading, but not for you, for them. So buckle up. This isn't just court drama, this is a spiritual reckoning in a legal disguise. And the gavel didn't just drop, it exploded. Number one, they never expected divine law to override their legal tricks. They built their case thinking they had it all locked down. Fake witnesses, altered documents, connections in all the right places. They believed the system would bend for them like it always had. They underestimated one thing: you were backed by divine law. While they were calling in favors and throwing around dirty money, something bigger was already in motion. What they didn't know is that your name wasn't just randomly on that inheritance. It was rightfully sealed by something higher than human hands. They believed because you were quiet, alone, or didn't come from their side of the family, you were easy to erase. But the truth is, you were never a threat to be silenced. You were a verdict waiting to be announced. While they played chess with lies, the real game was already over in the spiritual realm. That will wasn't just paperwork. It was prophecy, a divine instruction hidden in plain sight. And the moment you showed up, every plan they crafted started to unravel. They thought the law was on their side because they bought pieces of it. But this time heaven filed its own motion. The rules they twisted for years suddenly refused to work. The very people they trusted to play along started stuttering. Timelines got exposed. Emails resurfaced. Documents they swore never existed suddenly showed up like ghosts. It wasn't coincidence, Ed. It was divine correction. You didn't walk into court alone. God walked in with you, not to defend you, but to reveal the truth. What was supposed to be a clean sweep turned into an unexpected storm. One by one, their lies crumbled. Their stories clashed, and that smug confidence on their faces turned into silent panic. Because in the end, it wasn't just about what you inherited, it was about what they tried to steal, and who they tried to steal it from. And when divine law steps in, it doesn't negotiate, it overrules. Number two, your bloodline didn't just entitle you, it activated you. This wasn't just about money or property. What you inherited went way deeper than numbers in a bank account or names on a document. You weren't just connected to the bloodline. You were the activation code. There are some people who are born into families, and then there are people who are sent into them. You were the one sent, not just to exist, but to restore what was broken, correct what was stolen, and carry the legacy that everyone else tried to fumble or fake. They thought the inheritance was about titles and land. You understood it was about alignment, the kind of alignment that only happens when destiny collides with time. That inheritance didn't just belong to you on paper, it belonged to you spiritually. There's a reason they kept trying to block you, overlook you, minimize you. Because deep down they knew what it really meant if you ever stepped into your rightful position. It meant every cover-up would fall apart. Every lie would lose weight. Every manipulated version of the story would have to come undone. You didn't fight to gain something. You stood up because the inheritance was a part of your calling. It was tied to your identity, and there's nothing more dangerous to a manipulative family than the one person who can't be bribed or controlled. You weren't just in the will. You were the reason the will existed. That's why the attacks came so hard. That's why they tried to label you the outsider, the mistake, the problem. But the truth is, you were the answer they hoped no one would find out about. And now that it's public, they're spiraling because all along they thought you were just another relative. What they missed is that you were the remedy, the one who carried the authority, the favor, the promise. And when that kind of inheritance gets activated, no manipulation, no lie, no fake alliance can stop what's already sealed. Number 3, you weren't just in court, you were in a spiritual battlefield. They thought it was just another legal case. Just a matter of who had the better lawyer, the better connections, or the loudest voice in the room. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just a courtroom. This was a spiritual battleground. And they walked in thinking they were up against you, but they were really up against something they couldn't even see or control. You weren't fighting for property. You were standing for generations of truth that had been buried, ignored, or twisted to fit their selfish agenda. What made this battle different was the unseen weight behind it. There was pressure, yes, confusion, delays, strange obstacles popping up out of nowhere. That wasn't coincidence, that was resistance, not from people, but from spirits that had been feeding off stolen power for years. This case stirred up more than legal tension. It disturbed a dark system that had gotten way too comfortable operating unchecked. That's why you were under attack in ways that didn't even make sense. Random distractions, financial pressure, smear campaigns, people turning on you without reason. It wasn't just opposition, it was retaliation. The enemy knew you weren't just trying to win a case. You were closing a door that had been left open for too long. You were shutting down access to a flow of generational blessings that had been hijacked. This wasn't about fairness, this was about restoration. And that's why the atmosphere shifted when you stepped in. You didn't walk in with ego, you walked in with assignment. And everything dark and hidden started panicking. Their masks started cracking. Their alliances started crumbling. Because they built their position on silence and secrecy, and you brought the one thing they couldn't stand: light. You didn't just survive the battle, you shifted the entire war. And now, even though they won't say it out loud, they know exactly what happened. They weren't just defeated, they were exposed by something much bigger than you. They lost because the real judge had already ruled. Number 4, you were the hidden heir. They thought they buried. They thought you were out of the picture, forgotten, disqualified, not important enough to be counted, not loud enough to be a threat. So they did what most threatened people do. They buried your name before it ever had a chance to breathe. Before the ink on the will even dried, they were already erasing you from conversations, leaving your name off documents, making quiet backroom moves to lock you out of what was rightfully yours. They believed if they acted fast enough and dirty enough, no one would ever question it. But what they didn't understand is that the real heir doesn't need applause to rise. You didn't need to fight for attention. You didn't even need to make noise. Your presence was enough to disturb every lie they built. You were hidden, yes, but not forgotten. Not by heaven, not by destiny. You were kept out of sight for a reason, because had you been visible too soon, they would have done even worse to wipe you out completely. You were protected by being overlooked. The power of your rise is that it didn't need an announcement. You emerged right when they thought they had secured everything. They thought it was over. But that's exactly when the real story began. What they feared most wasn't that you were gone. It was the terrifying realization that you were never gone in the first place, just silent, just watching, just waiting for the right moment. And when that moment came, you didn't step onto the scene with drama. You came with undeniable authority. Your victory was quiet on the outside, but it shattered everything they built behind closed doors. It wasn't just a win, it was a divine shockwave. What they spent years trying to hide was exposed in seconds. What they whispered in secret was now on public record, and they couldn't explain it, because there's no logic for what happens when a chosen one steps fully into their place. They tried to erase your existence. Instead, your name now echoes in places they thought you'd never enter. You weren't just the heir, you were the one sent to break the silence and rewrite the story completely. Number 5, your existence was the crime scene they wanted to cover up. You were never just a threat to their plans, you were the proof of everything they tried to hide. From the moment your name showed up on that inheritance document, panic set in. Not confusion, not surprise, panic. Because they knew it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some fluke or filing error. It was divine alignment exposing what they had been running from for years. Your very presence called out every lie they told, every deal made in the dark, every name they removed to keep control. They didn't just want you removed, they needed you to disappear, because your name didn't just show up, it broke the system they created. One signature with your bloodline attached destroyed the story they'd carefully crafted for years. And the scariest part for them? You weren't even trying to expose anyone. You were just being who you were, authentically, quietly, powerfully, and that was too much. Your existence was the crime scene. Every time you walked into the room, it reminded them that someone lied, that someone forged, that someone silenced, erased, and rewrote history so they could steal what didn't belong to them. And now the one person they thought would never resurface is holding the very evidence of their betrayal. That's not a coincidence. That's a reckoning. They wanted to keep everything neat, sweep your name under the rug, forge a few papers, pretend you never existed. But there are some names that can't be buried. Some inheritances that scream from the grave until justice is done. Yours was one of them. And when it came back up, so did all the guilt, shame, and unfinished business they tried to hide. You weren't just added to the will, you were the will, the divine will, a living correction to years of manipulation and dishonor. That's why they hate you. That's why they panic when you speak. Because everything they've built is unstable when you stand. And no matter how many lies they stack against you, nothing changes the fact that your inheritance isn't a gift. It's a divine restoration they were never meant to touch. Number 6. They got too comfortable playing God until the real one showed up. They thought they were untouchable. For years they moved like puppet masters, pulling strings, bending truth, rewriting history to suit their agenda. They'd gotten away with so much that they actually started to believe they were the final authority. They played roles in public, wore masks in private, and operated behind the scenes like gods in their own little world. And why wouldn't they? Every time they lied, the system protected them. Every time they stole, the silence of others rewarded them. Every time they sabotaged someone, it worked until you showed up. They saw this inheritance case as just another opportunity to bend things in their favor, another name to erase, another signature to manipulate. And they were confident, too confident, because the court they feared the least, the divine court, was the one watching most closely. They forgot that when God steps into a courtroom, titles, wealth, and influence mean nothing. Heaven doesn't care about who your lawyer is, it cares about truth. They tried everything, backdoor deals, paid testimonies, manufactured evidence. They whispered in halls they thought were private and sent documents they thought would stay hidden. But divine justice doesn't need cameras or microphones to gather receipts. God was building the case long before you even knew you'd have to show up. They played games with your name, and heaven answered with judgment. The moment you stepped into that space, the atmosphere shifted. Things started slipping out of their control. People who were once loyal to them started hesitating. Judges who used to look the other way started asking questions. Secrets that had been buried began crawling into the light, and they couldn't stop it, because they weren't fighting you. They were fighting the truth. And when the truth is backed by divine authority, there's no lie strong enough to stand against it. This wasn't karma. This wasn't luck. This was a divine reversal, a holy interruption in a system they thought they owned. And now they're left stunned, confused, scrambling for damage control, because they got too comfortable playing God. But this time the real one showed up and brought the verdict with him. Number 7, they called it greed, but you called it restoration. They labeled you greedy the moment you stood up for what was rightfully yours. The second you challenged their version of events, you were painted as money-hungry, ungrateful, manipulative, even though all you asked for was truth and fairness. But that's how people operate when they've benefited from a system of silence. When they've enjoyed stolen blessings for so long, justice feels like robbery. What they didn't understand is that you weren't fighting for wealth. You weren't fighting for houses or land or numbers in a trust fund. You were fighting for something much deeper, restoration. You were after the correction of years of lies. You wanted the truth acknowledged, the rightful legacy honored, the spiritual debt cleared. They saw property, you saw purpose. They wanted assets, you wanted alignment. To them, it looked like ambition. To you, it was obedience. You knew in your spirit that this wasn't about claiming something new. It was about recovering what was lost, what had been mismanaged, what had been hoarded by people who never had the authority to carry it in the first place. And yes, the paperwork backed you, but your real proof wasn't legal, it was spiritual. That inheritance was tied to your calling. It had your name on it because it was part of your assignment. That's why the opposition came so strong. That's why the gaslighting was intense. Because they weren't just trying to keep things, they were trying to keep you from waking up to who you really are. Because once you saw clearly, they knew it was over. Once you realized this wasn't greed, but restoration, the mask slipped. Their narrative lost power. The control they held for years started crumbling. You didn't take anything, you reclaimed it. You walked into what was yours, not because of entitlement, but because you were chosen to carry what others dropped. This wasn't you stealing, this was you stepping into legacy. And while they called it greed, heaven called it justice. Number 8, their offense wasn't that you won, it's that you were meant to. They never hated you because you won. They hated you because deep down, they always knew you were supposed to. The truth they never said out loud, not even to themselves, was that you were the rightful heir from the very beginning. That's what ate at them. That's what made them lie, forge documents, spread rumors, and turn relatives into enemies. The issue was never the court case. It was your existence as living proof that their fake position was temporary. You didn't just disrupt their plans, you exposed the fact that they were never truly qualified to carry the legacy in the first place. The rage wasn't about the judge's verdict. It was about destiny's reminder. Because no matter how much they tried to pretend otherwise, your presence shook something ancient. You weren't just another family member. You were the one everything had been pointing to, even if no one wanted to admit it. And that kind of truth is violent to people who've built their identity on lies. That's why they acted like your win was an attack. It triggered the deep-rooted fear that they were never meant to have the power they've been clutching. They weren't defending a right. They were defending a lie. And when the truth finally stood tall in court, they didn't just lose a case. They lost the illusion that kept them relevant. All the manipulation, all the anger, all the schemes were just cover-ups for insecurity. They saw the oil on your life and tried to hijack the throne it came with. But favor isn't transferable, and no amount of bribery or noise can rewrite what heaven already wrote. That's why they can't celebrate. That's why they're still bitter, still spinning stories, still trying to act like you tricked the system, because it hurts more than anything to realize that no matter how hard they fought, they were never meant to win. The inheritance didn't just slip through their fingers. It was never theirs to touch. You didn't just come for it. You came from it. That truth burns. And that's the real offense they'll never say out loud. Number 9, their whole lives were built on illegitimate favor. They weren't just fighting for an inheritance. They were fighting to protect a life built on fraud. Their entire reputation, lifestyle, and sense of power were constructed on foundations that were never truly theirs. They inherited positions through deception, not lineage. They lived off stolen access, unearned recognition, and fake authority passed down like heirlooms. For years they thrived because no one questioned the origin of their favor. But the moment truth stepped into the room, everything they built started to shake. Illegitimate favor looks strong until it's tested. On the surface, they appeared blessed, respected, connected, praised. But it was all borrowed light, taken from people they pushed into the shadows. You were one of them. While they were being celebrated, you were being silenced. While they enjoyed the fruits, you were denied your roots. But what they never prepared for was divine timing, because God doesn't forget what man tries to erase. Their fear wasn't just losing wealth, it was losing the story they told themselves and everyone else. They knew the foundation was cracked, but they just kept decorating the house. The moment the truth about your inheritance came to light, it sent a ripple through their entire reality. Suddenly the spotlight they loved started to feel like exposure. What used to be praise turned into pressure. Because once the truth shows up, it doesn't just correct, it confronts. Divine audit isn't loud, it doesn't need chaos. It walks in with order and watches as the false thrones collapse under their own weight. That's what happened. Their kingdom wasn't stolen in a day. It expired when you showed up, because truth has a timestamp. It may delay, but it never dies. And when it arrives, illegitimate favor can't survive it. They tried to hold on to power with manipulation, but God holds the title deed. And when heaven pulls the receipts, no bribe, no alliance, no intimidation can stand. You didn't just win a case, you triggered a reckoning. And now the empires they built on lies are crumbling, not because you exposed them, but because truth finally demanded a seat at the table. Number 10. The same mouths that lied in court will be forced to testify on your behalf. They lied with confidence, thinking the courtroom was theirs to control. They rehearsed those false testimonies like lines in a play, never imagining the script would flip. But what they didn't realize is that when you're up against a chosen one, lies don't hold up for long, especially not in a courtroom where divine justice has already settled the matter. They thought their smooth-talking, fake tears and bold denials would win the day. Instead, they set themselves up for one of the greatest reversals they'll ever experience. Because when God is involved, perjury doesn't just backfire, it prophesies. The very mouths that lied on your name, distorted facts and painted you as unworthy will end up being the same ones that confirm your rightful place. Not willingly, not even knowingly, but they'll speak in circles until the truth slips out. That's how divine strategy works. He doesn't need to silence your enemies. He'll use them as evidence. Their words were designed to bury you, but they've only built your stage. What they said in arrogance will now echo in judgment. Every exaggerated story, every manipulated fact, every false accusation, they're all being flipped in real time. Suddenly people are asking questions. Inconsistencies are being uncovered. Their credibility is crumbling right where they thought it was cemented, because lies don't age well under divine exposure. And what seemed airtight in court is now unraveling thread by thread. You don't even have to defend yourself anymore. The same mouths that slandered you will end up revealing more than they ever intended. Some out of guilt, some under pressure, and some because the truth is just too heavy to keep carrying. Their reputations will suffer the fallout. The influence they built on deception will rot from the inside out, not because you destroyed them, but because they testified against someone who was divinely backed. And that's the plot twist no one saw coming. They thought they were burying you, but they were building your vindication. Now watch how God uses their own words as the final stamp of truth. Number 11, you didn't just beat the case, you unraveled a generational curse. This was never just about a courtroom decision or a name on a will. It was spiritual surgery. What happened through this case cut deeper than legalities. It exposed and severed patterns that had been running silently through your bloodline for generations. You weren't just defending your right to an inheritance, you were confronting everything that had been swept under the rug, every secret, every manipulation, every dark deal made behind closed doors to keep certain people in power and others in chains. You weren't the first to be mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. Others before you saw the injustice, felt it, but either didn't survive it or didn't have the strength to fight it. You did. You stood in the middle of a storm that was designed to take you out and instead walked out with the truth in your hand and a curse broken under your feet. That courtroom was more than a legal battleground, it was an altar. And the verdict wasn't just for you, it was for the ones who never got the chance to speak, and the ones after you who won't have to fight the same demons. This win exposed the rot, the fake alliances, the generational gatekeepers who built their lives on control, secrecy, and stolen legacies. You pulled the veil off a system that was never righteous, just rehearsed. And the moment you claimed your rightful place, it caused a spiritual reset. What used to flow freely, favor through fraud, wealth through manipulation, power through silence, has been cut off at the root. You shut down an entire cycle. That's why it was so hard. That's why the fight was so fierce. You weren't just dealing with people, you were facing generational patterns dressed up as tradition. But you didn't flinch. You didn't bow. And because of that, what ruled your family for decades ends with you. You didn't just win a case, you shifted a bloodline. And the curse that carried arrogance, secrecy, and illegitimacy, it ends here. Number 12. They thought the will was paper, but it was a weapon. They looked at that will and saw paper, ink, legal jargon. They saw something they could bend, forge, manipulate, just like they always did. What they didn't realize was that this particular document didn't just name an heir, it revealed one. That will wasn't just a legal formality, it was spiritual warfare in disguise, and the signature that sealed it. That wasn't just a name, it was a prophetic trigger. You weren't just listed, You were activated. That paper carried weight they couldn't see because they were too busy plotting in the physical realm to understand what was happening in the spiritual one. While they schemed over clauses and beneficiaries, heaven was marking a shift in destiny. The will became the weapon. The inheritance became the battlefield. And you became the breaker, the one chosen to confront every lie, uproot every hidden agenda, and carry the mantle they were never qualified to touch. The reason they panicked when your name appeared wasn't confusion, it was recognition. On some level, they knew what that signature meant. It meant time was up, it meant the game was over, it meant every deal done in the dark was about to be exposed under divine light. That signature carried justice, it carried memory, it carried generational recompense. They didn't just see your name, they felt the power behind it. They tried to diminish it, mock it, dismiss it, but no amount of denial can void what heaven has already ratified. They thought they were fighting you, they weren't. They were fighting the manifestation of truth wrapped in legal ink. That document, with your name on it, carried the authority of every tear cried by those who were robbed, silenced, erased. And the pen stroke they tried to overlook, that was the sound of chains breaking. This wasn't about property, it was about prophecy. You weren't just granted the inheritance, you were authorized to carry it. And now that the weapon has been drawn, no lie can stand. They thought the will was a formality, but it turned out to be the one thing they couldn't outrun because what they thought was paper was loaded. Number 13, they can't handle that you look like the God they mocked. They mocked your faith when it was quiet, rolled their eyes when you spoke about purpose, laughed behind closed doors, convinced that your belief in divine timing and justice was just naive hope. To them, you were too spiritual, too soft, too detached from the real world of power plays and manipulation. But now you stand as the very evidence of the God they joked about, and that's what's choking them. You didn't just survive their sabotage, you rose in spite of it. You didn't need to claw your way to the top or kiss the right rings. You didn't lie, cheat, or sell your soul. You simply stood in truth. And somehow truth was enough. That terrifies them because everything they built was based on the idea that God was either absent, asleep, or indifferent. But your elevation shattered that illusion. You're walking proof that God was always watching and always planning. You don't need to preach a sermon, your presence is one. The favor on your life speaks louder than any defense. That's why they're so desperate to discredit you. If they can label you unstable, greedy, dramatic, or even dangerous, they can avoid the real issue, that they've been mocking the very source of your strength. And if you're real, then He is real. That's the part they can't face. Now they're scrambling, not just because you won, but because your victory means everything they denied is true. They see your poise under pressure and mistake it for arrogance. They see your peace in chaos and label it delusion. They can't admit the truth, so they try to redefine you as a threat. Because it's easier to criminalize someone than to confess you were wrong about them. You didn't ask to be a mirror, but you are. And when liars look into a mirror of righteousness, they either change or rage. And right now they're raging. Not because you faked your way to the top, but because you got there with God. You look like the very power they said didn't exist. And that's the one reflection they never wanted to face. Number 14, they're not mad you won. They're mad the system didn't work this time. They weren't shocked that you fought. They were shocked that you won. Because in their minds, everything was already rigged in their favor. The system was supposed to protect them. The money, the connections, the rehearsed lies, the backroom handshakes, all of it was designed to make sure someone like you never stood a chance. And to be honest, in most cases it would have worked, but not this time. Because this time they weren't just up against a person, they were up against purpose. They didn't expect divine alignment to interfere with their plans. They had the paperwork, they had allies in the room, they had people paid to stay quiet and others positioned to speak lies as truth. But what they didn't account for was that heaven had already ruled. Spiritual authority doesn't need permission to interrupt corruption. It doesn't negotiate with manipulation. It overrides it. That's what broke them. The realization that their influence couldn't overpower your inheritance. Their strategy couldn't shake your standing. Every time they thought they had you cornered, something slipped through their fingers. Truth, clarity, favor. They tried to use the same tools that had always worked before. Fear, smear campaigns, delay tactics, even threats. But this time it all collapsed. Because God had already decided, and no human system has the power to veto a divine decision. This was never just a court battle, it was a confrontation between the counterfeit and the called. They were confident because the system had always bent for them. But what do you do when the thing you trust most fails? That's what they're grappling with now. They're not mad at you. They're mad that their weapons malfunctioned, that the laws they manipulated turned around and exposed them, that the loopholes they counted on were sealed by justice itself. They weren't prepared for favor that doesn't flinch. And now they're scrambling, not just because they lost, but because their loss revealed a terrifying truth. The power they thought they had was never real to begin with. And when divine alignment shows up, it doesn't just change outcomes, it exposes the illusion of control. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a spiritual upheaval, a divine reckoning wrapped in court documents and silence-breaking moments. Every scheme they launched, every lie they told, every alliance they tried to weaponize against you was rooted in one thing: fear. Not fear of you as a person, but fear of what your victory represents. Because when someone chosen by God rises through fire instead of favoritism, it signals a system breakdown. And for them, that's the ultimate threat. You didn't just win an inheritance, you interrupted a bloodline of unchecked corruption. You shattered generational agreements built on deceit. You disrupted the comfortable cycle of spiritual blindness masquerading as tradition. You proved that legitimacy isn't inherited through control, it's revealed through calling. They tried to label you as greedy, rebellious, dramatic, but all those labels fell flat the moment you stood in truth and didn't flinch. You didn't need theatrics, you had divine backing. They never thought you'd make it this far. They assumed the system would do what it always did: protect the familiar, punish the faithful. But you were the anomaly, the prophecy in flesh, the unshakable contradiction to every backroom deal and whispered lie. You were never supposed to survive the fire, but not only did you survive, you re-emerged with the deed in your hand and the curse beneath your feet. Now their anger isn't just about the assets, it's about the exposure. You didn't just take what was yours, you pulled the curtain back on everything they pretended to be. Your win forced the truth into daylight, and the truth came swinging. It broke their illusion of control, it disrupted the performance, and most painfully it reminded them that God is not to be mocked, so let them talk. Let them spin their stories and call it anything but what it is. Because at the end of the day, you don't need their applause. You've already got heaven's stamp. You weren't elevated by chance. You were established by purpose. And that makes your inheritance untouchable, your rise irreversible, and your story unforgettable. You didn't just beat the case, you broke the curse, exposed the lie, and stepped into destiny. Now the system that tried to silence you must answer to the God who sent you. If this message spoke to something deep inside you, don't just scroll away. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now, because this isn't just content, it's confirmation. Like this video, if you know what it means to be counted out, overlooked, or lied on, but still rise anyway. Comment below and let me know which part hit you the hardest. I want to hear your story, your victory, your breakthrough. You never know who your words might heal. And don't keep this to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that divine justice is real, spiritual inheritance is powerful, and the truth always finds its voice. Send it to the silent fighters, the hidden heirs, the ones who've been battling in the shadows. This is more than a moment. This is movement. So stay connected, because the story isn't over, and neither is your rise. Let's keep walking this journey together.